My name is Isaac Levin. I am a product marketing manager in Azure Marketing. So what I do is I'm responsible for the end-to-end content development for our first-party events in DevOps and tooling. So if you see a demo with Scott Hanselman or Scott Guthrie, myself or somebody on my team was heavily involved in that story. So to get to the content here, one of the things that I've always loved. I've been a work from home person for a long time. Actually, this role at Microsoft is my first work in office gig. Well, not right now, but first work in office gig in 5 years. So I've been working from home for a long time. And I used to take advantage of this application called Skew, I think is what it was called, where it was basically a tray app that connected between your Skype for Business instance on your machine and a Phillips Hue Light. It used COM APIs and a bunch of really other unsavory things. And I longed for the day when we were able to not be tethered to a machine to be able to do fun things like this. So I had been looking around on user voice in Teams. And one of the things that I looked for was, when are they going to have like the presence API available? Because I know that Teams makes a graph call every single time it gets presence. So I nicely nudged one of the people from Microsoft that responded in that chat train, and he said, look for it in beta around this time. And I think probably either the first or the second day it was launched is when I started fiddling around with it. And I had a proof of concept up pretty quickly, which has grown into something a bit bigger that's maybe a bit more usable for folks. And one of the things that I want to be able to do is make this available to everybody, regardless if you work at Microsoft or not, but also just give people an understanding of how Graph works. So with that, I can do a demo if that's what people have interest in.
That'd be great.
Yeah, cool. So let me share my screen out. Let me do that, share my screen.
And for those that maybe aren't familiar with the light bulb scene, what's the deal there? You've used a particular one, but is the implementation tied to that brand of bulb or globe, depending on the world you are?
So right now it works for Philips Hue. I have a really rough working version that works with LifeX. And the goal is to be able to interact with as many of the Wi-Fi enabled bulbs as possible. Obviously, each implementation is a bit different. I realized that for LifeX, there wasn't like a great great SDK for their API, so I actually wrote one. It's on GitHub now. I need to make some change. Yeah, I need to make some changes to it, but it worked for my particular prototype, so I just wanted to get up running there. But the application that you see here, this is it's a WPF application, so it runs in Windows only. It's called Presence Light. It's available on GitHub, and there's information about setting it up on GitHub. But the long and short of it is that you have to, with Philips in particular, and sorry, the UI needs some work too. With Philips in particular, the bulbs aren't connected to the internet. The bulbs are connected to a bridge, which is connected to the internet. So in order for you to take full advantage of changing the colors of bulbs, you actually have to send the data through a bridge. So I have my internal IT of my bridge, and I can actually specify the light that I'm using. So that's the part that actually hooks you up to Philips Hue. For Graph itself, I'm using the Graph API and a bunch of other internal mechanisms like MSAL and things like that that people are probably aware of to log in the user and then pull the Presence API to give me what my presence is. So if I log in here, you can see that my light changed color really, really quickly, right? So if I change my teams to available, and this does, I'm not polling like immediately, I'm polling like every couple of seconds. So
where is your light, by the way? Because your camera is like,
is that better?
Okay.
Better?
Keep that in view, and that way we can see it.
Yeah, that's cool.
And the code at the same time.
And the code at the same time?
Teams, we have to select your picture to see the light, and then we can't see the code that you're running.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't have Visual. I don't have Visual Studio.
It's not an Isaac thing.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't have Visual Studio up right now. This is actually running like the actual installed version. So this application you can actually get. I can give you the link, Jeremy. So I have two versions. I have a version for Microsoft folks and a version for non-Microsoft folks. And the
Yeah.
reason for I have a Microsoft folks one is because in order to get the Presence API up and running, you have to create an Azure AD application. And let's just say for large IT organizations, it's not very easily done to set that up. Microsoft being one of them, but it's very, very easy once you actually know the process. So I'm just going to go ahead and change my status one more time. So I'm going to change it to busy. And what will happen is that this icon here will change color and the light changes red, right? So that's one of the cool things. And as well, since it is a tray app, I can actually close it here. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but let's see if I can zoom in here. So you see this little guy?
Yeah, that's
so
cool.
that's a tray app that actually indicates what my Teams presence is. So if I change this to available, this will change to green.
No, that's really
right?
cool.
So that's kind of the cool things that I've got going on with that. I also wanted to show you one of the things that I'm working on. The downside to using Presence Light in its current capacity is that it runs on Windows. And there's a lot of people that might want to take advantage of being able to broadcast your presence to a bulb in your house without Windows machines. Maybe they run Mac, maybe they have Linux. So I'm actually in the process of writing a .NET Core Blazor application that does this for you. So in here, I'm running in WSL, which is Windows Subsystem for Linux right now, and I can actually prove that. If I open up Google Chrome here, this is going to pop open a window. This is what is my user agent, and as you can see, it says that I'm running Linux, right? So one of the things that I can do here is I can actually run my application inside of Windows Subsystem for Linux. It's actually going to pop a web window that's going to allow me to log in, and then it's going to do the exact same thing that we did in Presence Light, except it runs cross-platform. So let's start this guy up. And this is still like a working prototype, so it's not fully baked yet. But as you can see here, it's telling me what my presence is here. It's broadcasting this, and it can change it here. So, and this will update too. But the beauty of this is that once I close this web browser, everything still works. So if I change this back to available, this light is going to change back to green. So I don't even need the browser up, and all I need is this application that's running in process. So it's one of those things where trying to get the experience of Presence Light or just be able to broadcast your presence using the Presence API to multiple platforms if possible. So that's kind
really
of
cool.
what I've been working on lately. So the goal is to get this is to kind of clean up some of the hiccups with the WPF side, make it like really fully baked so folks that aren't technical can take advantage of it. And then for folks that are a bit more technical, or if they're on Mac or Linux, they can take advantage of the other one. And I'll be sure to make sure that, Jeremy, that you get the links to a lot of the downloads of stuff. And yeah, so this has been really, really fun. And I really appreciate, you and everybody on the Graphs team patience with me, because I've been asking a lot of questions and probably being a bit frustrating. But I think one of the things that I've been taking full advantage of since I've worked at Microsoft is if I can find somebody's information, like in the GAL, or the global address list, and figure out what they do, and if they can help me, I'm going to take advantage of that. So
Yeah,
that's my demo. And like Jeremy showed, my Twitter handle is Isaac R11. If you have any questions about Presence Light or just what was done to set up the Presence API, I know in these times everybody needs to take full advantage of everything we can when we're working from home. So I hope people set some value there.
So I'd love to see some code. I know you don't have Visual Studio open, but I'm just sharing the GitHub repo in the chat. Is there any chance you could show us where the key call is to the graph, and then we can just talk a little bit more about the API itself as well?
Sure.
So one thing while Isaac's doing that, the Presence API is still in beta, and so for fun things like that, this is fine. But rolling this out to a corporate environment and doing this as a standard within your office, obviously being in beta has some risk associated with it. Things will may change. The whole idea of our beta period is that if the API gets feedback and we need to change the signature of the API or how the behavior of the API, that we will do that. We do tend to now blog if we're going to make changes that will impact you even if you are using beta, but it's just worth bearing in mind our supportability state with a beta API.
Yeah, that's a good call out, right? Like beta software is always subject to change. So one of the things that's really great about the Graph API as well, and the Presence API, obviously, well, just Graph in general, is that the SDK is really, really well baked. So, if
Daryl will
if
be
they're
happy that you said
if
that,
they're
Isaac. We didn't have
if,
to even give you any money for that.
well, you don't know what's going on the side, right? So, but one of the things that's great about the Graph SDK is that it handles a lot of the things for you, right? So, for instance, like wiring up like all of the clients and things like that, like that's challenging at times. So, there's a lot of samples online and there's a lot of things in the SDK that are very helpful. So I want to actually show you the code that I actually use to just make a call to Graph. So if I go so this is it right here. Basically, so since I'm using the Graph SDK, all I have to do is just call the me endpoint, the me endpoint, which is basically just getting your context, and then presence, and that's it. So it's really, really easy. And while you were actually talking, I actually did spin up Visual Studio. So give me 1 second to move it over to this window, and I'll just show you kind of the things that you can do inside the Graph API, right? So, and this is the Lifix version, so I'm still working on some of the kinks here. But if I go to find me dot,
I can just see everyone at home and their partners are going to be like staring at the globe now, waiting for these things to go back from red to green. It's going to be all your fault, Isaac.
Yeah, I've been talking to some folks from Microsoft who are already like their wives are already irritated. Because one of the things when I first rolled this out is I didn't give you the ability to select a light. So if you had a bunch of lights, it would change all the lights colors. So one gentleman told me his wife was like, if you do this again, like you're gonna have to go work somewhere else, like in the garage.
She's like unscrewing all the light bulbs around the house.
Exactly. So the Graph API. So once you actually wire up like an authenticated client, like you have access to like a ton of things, right? So for most of the stuff that you want to do, you want to get me. So me is just your user profile. So like I'm not just getting the Presence API when I use Presence Light. I'm actually getting my photo, as you saw. There's my photo was there, and also my name, right? So me is in your name, and I can actually just show you what that looks like. Where is one of the things I got to do as well here is I got to clean up a lot of this code. This code is looking pretty rough these days. So what I'm doing here is I call this get batch content. And what this does is it actually makes a batch request using the Graph SDK to get a user, the presence, and then the photo. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually just doing that. And as you can see, it's not a lot of code, right? So it's graph service client.me.request. That gets you a user presence. Graph service.me.presence.request. That gets you the Presence API. And if you want to get a photo, it's just a matter of sending across, me.photo.content, and that gets you a byte stream back with the photo in it. So again, the SDK is awesome. You can actually do a lot of this as well without the SDK. Like everything is just REST requests. I think I have a sample of the REST request. So give me 1 second. Might not be in it. No, I'm using the API there. I might not have it in this branch, but there's some code definitely on GitHub that shows you how to do it. So let me hop over here.
What made you pick WPF? Was it because you really had in mind of the tray and the fact that you wanted that thing to be in the bottom right so you can easily see it as an app running on your machine? Obviously, the world seems to snap to web by default, and so just interested in that approach.
Yeah, so one of the things I like the idea of having I fell in love with the concept of having like the little icon down at the bottom, and that's probably the worst way to build an application. But one of the things that I ran into when I was playing around, so the original goal was to have this run on a Raspberry Pi, not connected to anything. So I just have a Raspberry Pi running, pulling my presence. Unfortunately, some of the things that I'm trying to do, you don't have the ability to do that in application mode. You can only do it in delegated mode. So basically, you can only run it as a user interactively. So I have to go and get a token, right? So I can't really do that easily running in a daemon or some sort of headless item like a Raspberry Pi or some other IoT device. So I was like, okay, well, if I need to be tethered to a machine to actually get the token, I might as well have a user experience behind it. And I really like the idea of just the WPF app because I think that's what people would gravitate towards, especially if it was in the store, which I have a goal of putting into the store at some point. And then I ran into obviously an issue. It's like, okay, well, if it's WPF, it only runs on Windows. So that's when I started to build out this other version, which is like a background service running in the background and a web UI for settings, and they talk to each other. So that's kind of where I've kind of come to. There's probably a million different ways you can do this as well. You can probably do this without Azure Functions or other things. The only thing is that the user actually has to get the token interactively. So yeah, so if you run into a situation where you get prompted for a login, like you can use this anywhere, right? So as long as you can get a token and pass that token somewhere, you can do whatever. And then you just obviously have to figure out like maintaining the state of that token when it expires. But
one interesting thing, and this is good for graph developers in general to hear, is MSIT internally have a conditional access rule on certain products that we use, that we have to be domain joined or the device needs to be managed. So for instance, my iPhone to use Teams on it requires the company portal app to be on there so that I can register the device and it's now Intune managed, and then I can install Teams and use it. And because of that conditional access policy, things like this means that if I downloaded Isaac's app and tried to run it on a laptop that wasn't domain joined, it wouldn't actually work because the Graph API will actually listen to those conditional access rules and block like that. And so some of the nature of if Teams is conditional access, this presence is part of that conditional access policy. And so you just have to be aware of those things as you're going through it. As Isaac mentioned, this is only for delegated permissions right now. It isn't for application permissions. I believe there is a user voice already. So if there is scenarios where you'd like to see this as a daemon service, I know I've seen people that would like actually multiple light bulbs on their desk that they can just glance at and see that people are available or not. Because right now, Isaac's polling is just for his presence, but you can actually do it for other users as well with different permission requests.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's one of those things where, I've found a way to work around it. But yeah, like being able to see the presence of somebody else is very interesting. And for anybody that's interested, if you don't want to use the Graph SDK for whatever reason, it's very, very easy to wire up a Graph call, right? So I have an access token that I'm passing into my HTTP client, and then that's the endpoint, and that's it, right? I'm cheating a little bit here because I'm actually using the Graph SDK for the presence object, and I'm serializing into it, but I'm not making the HTTP call with the SDK. I'm using the object underlying that are in the SDK because it just makes more sense that way.
There was a question in the chat about can you set the presence? The answer is no. Right now, it's just a get presence, either for yourself on WhackMe or users/user ID and then presence.
One thing to call out as well is that if you look at the documentation for Microsoft Teams, so it collects not just all of the user configured states, but also the app configured as well. So if you really want to know, hey, if you want people to know, hey, don't bother me, I'm presenting, for instance, like right now, I could have it be any color specifically, right? You're not just controlled by the ones that you can actually set in the tool itself. It'll actually read in and say, okay, well, it looks like Isaac is presenting because he's sharing his screen. Change the color to a particular thing. You can definitely wire that up very, very easily using the Presence API, because the Presence API not only has the availability that you set, but it also has some additional data as pertains to what the actual state of what you are in Teams is.
And so the other thing I noticed in your code is you do have a polling mechanism in there because you're keep constantly checking that.
Yep.
So obviously that's a fair bit of load on Graph in terms of the calls. What kind of timing are you checking in your instance the polling on a loop?
Yeah. So I'm only polling for presence every 5 seconds. So so obviously I don't know what the rate limits exactly are. But yeah, what would happen really quickly is if I was polling like every half second, I imagine that at some point Graph would get irritated. I think 5 seconds is enough for my particular use case because 5 seconds isn't a ton of time between the changing of colors. But if you really want like a high fidelity thing that is actually checking presence like very, very perfectly real time, like you are going to have to take care of those rate limits.
Right.
So that's one thing to call out. And another thing as well is that this is polling, obviously. Hopefully in the future, the graph team can set up some sort of webhook or something like that, so we don't have to be polling. But right now, I think there's some value there in seeing what our
I think
options
there
are
is
for,
actually
like,
a user
webhooks.
voice, and I can see Vincent posting the user voice links in the chat, but I believe there is a user voice for the webhook as well as the app only requests,
Yep.
which are the two ones that I've seen from these scenarios being built. And then Harlan had a question as well around any idea when we might be able to get last seen or away since date time. I haven't heard about that one. If you can put it as a user voice request, Harlan, and I'll get the PM that kind of owns those things to kind of give any indication of whether it's on the roadmap or not. And there's Vincent. Thank you, Vincent, for posting the webhook subscription for Teams Presence, which has 23 votes right now. It'll be interesting to see after seeing this whether that goes up. With a little bit of time left, is there anything else you wanted to share, Isaac, in terms of your learnings of using the graph? I had one call out with the throttling. If you're using the SDK and you do thrash it, so you change that down to milliseconds to go check, the SDK will back off with the fact the service will tell you've hit the 429 limits.
Okay.
And so it will wait a certain amount of time and then it will try again for you. Whereas if you just do straight HTTP calls, you'd have to do the back off logic yourself. So that's one benefit of using the SDK with this aspect too.
Yeah, and I think one of the things as well is that I think the reason why I wanted to show both is that to be like hitting the Graph API just like with using a curl or using an HTTP client is very, very easy. When you're wiring up the Graph SDK clients, there is some subtleties in there that you have to pay attention to the docs on. So it's one of those things where I'd like to show both. So it's definitely one of those things. Also, as well, one of the things I didn't talk about really heavily was okay, so you log in to Azure Active Directory, right? And then that gets turned into something else that allows you to make a call, right? So there is some finessing that goes on that takes your access token from Azure AD and then it sends it over to Graph. You need particular permissions set up in with your application, right? So you need user.presence.read. That's one of the ones that you need. And there are a couple of them that are marked as admin consent only. So it's one of those things that if you do want this in your own sub, you are going to have to work with internal IT to make sure that you're meeting any governance standards that you have.
Yeah, and that's definitely feedback we would like around this. There is discussions internally that questions admin consent being required for this particular API. So we'd love to have your feedback in the chat window or Twitter or even in user voice if you feel like this is that big of an ask not to require admin consent. It's something that we've put in based on compliance and privacy kind of scenarios that we feel like this is something that needs to be protected by an admin consent approach. Interesting with MSIT, we have an internal process for requesting graph permissions. And Isaac, I don't know how long your experience was, but someone else internally did it. And MSIT turned it around in 24 hours, which under current global climate conditions, that MSIT must just feel like they're on fire. I figured that was pretty good that they turned that around that quickly.
Yeah, mine didn't take very long either. I think the hardest part was there's an email interaction, right? And I think the individual that I'm working with wasn't on the same time zone as me, so there was just a gap there. But yeah, I think it took maybe 2 days. Which is really nothing. Which is really nothing when you think about it, right?
Yeah, I guess it just depends how the IT department, they're running Microsoft 365, how familiar they are with this stuff, and being able to send them the right set of information of this is what this means, and here's some guidance for you as an IT pro, which I know Microsoft Identity have, which makes that a lot easier. So Isaac, we have Beth presenting as well today, so I just want to say thanks so much, mate. I really appreciate you sharing that and getting that on GitHub and getting it in the store will make things super easy for people who don't even want to download code and compile it and run it.
Yeah, so one of the things as well is that you don't have to download the code and compile and run it. So I'll get you a link. You can actually install the WPF application in sideload mode. So you don't need to download code and do any compilation. The only thing that's hard, so to say, with getting Presence Light up and running is you have to create the Azure AD application, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Other than that, everything else, I can make it as easy as possible for folks. But again, you still are going to have to do something in the Azure AD tenant to get that to work. But again, thanks for letting me chat about something that I've been playing around with for a couple of months. And I'm active on Twitter, like Jeremy said. So if anybody has any questions or feedback, just let me know. I'm also taking contributions. So if you are good with WPF, I would love your help because this is actually the first WPF I've ever written in my entire life. So it's been a fun thing to learn. So yeah, again, if you have any questions or comments or anything, just feel free to reach out. And thanks, Jeremy,
Yeah,
for
that's
having me.
awesome. Thanks, Isaac. I really appreciate that.